Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to talk about emotion regulation, both on an individual level and in the couple system.
This is a tricky one because, at least for me, I often hear partners say things like, it's not my fault, it's their fault. Or, well, they get angry first. But it's a cycle, people. It is a cycle. We have to both individually regulate, but also as a couple, finding how we regulate together.
What do you mean? If my partner would just change, everything would be perfect. It's their fault.
How many times we hear some variation of that? A lot.
Mm-hmm.
The answer's a lot.
And I think a lot of people, well, one, we have a hard time looking at ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it's easy to point the blame and find what's wrong with our partner of why things aren't. Because when things aren't going well, we try to find meaning naturally as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to look at ourselves as the meaning. So it must be our partner. And then we actually continue to use that lens to look at their behaviors and words. And then we confirm our own bias.
It's incredibly vulnerable to say, oh, wait, I've got my own work to do, or this one was me, or taking ownership for my part.
Yeah. And John Gottman's research talks about accepting influence and
Mm-hmm.
part of that being a predictor of long-term success for relationships. And that's a very hard thing to do because accepting influence is being vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
and seeing how you can play a role in it. And a lot of the fear is, well, I don't want to be seen as the reason, because if I am, they're going to leave me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or if I take ownership here, it lets them off the hook.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Power play, right? So if I say I'm sorry, or I say this was my part, is my partner going to own theirs? Does that mean they just get away with whatever they just did?
That's a really good point. I see a lot of lack of reciprocity and acceptance of influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one partner will be really good at it, and the other will be like, good. Okay, good now. We're good now. Wait, hold on.
Wait.
What role did you play? You just called them a piece of shit. Oh no, that was in response to them.
That part right there. Well, I wouldn't have said it if you didn't, right? We've talked about this in previous episodes. Your apology cannot be contingent on someone else's stuff, right? I'm sorry I did that, but I wouldn't have if you had just done the dishes, if you didn't yell at me first. Not how this works.
And what's that really saying? And you hate this, but what's that really saying? You made me.
No one makes you feel anything or do anything.
Yeah. And this is where the emotion regulation on an individual level comes in. And that's not to say that even us as trained therapists, there's some things that will push buttons.
No, I don't have any buttons. What are you talking about? No.
And ultimately, let's talk to your husband about that one. And but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's okay. I don't have control over them, like just going off on me. And I can remove myself if it gets dangerous or safety. How do I manage my stress? Right?
Yeah.
How do I regulate myself to be able to navigate this a little bit more effectively? So instead of responding with like defensiveness or attack back, I can navigate this and see what's going on for them. Because a lot of times if we were to look at their cycle, we want to understand what emotions and behaviors are driving that.
Mm-hmm.
Like what is happening? So they're criticizing you, but why?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes when you uncover it, I feel like they don't care about me.
Mm-hmm.
And they get defensive and then criticize, or I feel like I'm not good enough.
Yep.
And then they criticize. And then when we're able to ask those questions and soften that, we can get to that. But if we're just responding through like defensiveness and things like that, we can't. And the best way to break that, or at least one of the better ways, is regulate your side of the cycle to hopefully inevitably change the other side.
Because I tell couples all the time, you don't have to join in your partner's chaos. Just because my partner is angry, huffing and puffing, whatever, doesn't mean I have to join in that part. And in fact, if we can regulate ourselves, take that breath, we'll talk about some tools in a minute. If I can regulate myself and turn to my partner and say, wow, I'm noticing you're pretty upset. How can I support you? Or can I give you a hug? That takes all the wind out of that chaos. And it keeps us from going down the rabbit hole of massive blowups or shutting down or whatever happens in your particular cycle of conflict.
Yeah. And we're talking ideal here. I still go into these cycles, right? Even being aware of them.
True.
Granted, they become less frequent and more tolerable and less peaks, less toxic.
The recovery becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah. And you see that with couples who actually work on this. They'll say, oh, we're not fighting as much. And if we do, it's not as toxic or intense. And we're recovering a lot faster from them.
And there's a difference between arguing and fighting, right? Arguing, we've got differences of opinion. We might go back and forth. Eventually we reach resolution. Fighting to me is more like the blaming, the name calling, the defensiveness. Those pieces don't serve. It's okay to argue with your partner. And in fact, we actually want you to, right? Because the absence of it is apathy. Apathy, your relationship is going nowhere fast.
Or avoidance.
Yep.
Which then it'll just dissipate too.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about here is the couple regulation now, right? How do we navigate this with our partner through communication, through responding in certain ways? And one way to help with that is how we regulate ourselves. And this is where the individual regulation comes in, is being aware of, why are you responding that way? Oh, I'm actually insecure. I'm really insecure that they're going to leave because of past relationships I've been cheated on. That's what we need to work on. That's where you on an individual are responsible for that. We're responsible for our own distress tolerance. Yes,
because no one, let me say it again, no one can make you feel or do anything.
Yeah.
Right? My partner, yes, if my partner is angry, I'm going to have an internal reaction. But then it's my choice on, okay, I'm feeling my heart rate elevating. I'm feeling like getting prickly. Am I going to address that and regulate, or am I going to buy into that and let myself kind of engage in that way?
And thinking about your response, like, am I responding from an emotional compass that's guiding my emotions, or guiding my compass? Or is it my value of, I want to make sure that we're safe as a dynamic, or myself. I want to make sure that we actually communicate and connect, because that's what I value, versus I'm emotionally responding because I'm triggered with what they said. And now I'm going to respond back with avoiding and just completely shutting down because clearly they don't love me.
A big part of this regulation is becoming aware of your physiological response, right? Often our body is showing we're angry before we even tune into the emotional part of our brain. So before I can say to myself, like, oh, I'm angry right now, my body is already clenching my fists, tightening my jaw, tightening my shoulders, getting red, my breathing changes. If you can back it up to start to notice where your body's changing at the very beginning stages, that's the place to regulate. Well, any point. But ideally, if we're catching it at our anger or irritations at a 3-4 rather than a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it gives us much greater chances for success to not escalate. But also, it's a lot easier to recover, right? If I get fully amped, that recovery is going to take a lot longer.
Yeah. And I love that work with when I'm working with individual clients is a lot of us aren't emotionally tuned well. We don't get the emotional language growing up because our parents didn't grab that, right?
It's a skill. We don't talk about that. It's a skill.
Intergenerational transmission of crappy coping.
Right. I cope the way I've learned through my parents.
And I love being, okay, what would you say you think you feel right now? Given the emotions wheel. Okay, sadness. Great. What's going on physiologically right now?
Where do you feel it?
And helping them identify the physiological cues, so then they can maybe identify what they're feeling through that. Because sometimes it's different, right? Like, ooh, sadness is in my stomach and my throat, or anger's in my jaw. And there are differences.
Or I'm hot.
Even if it's in the same spot, it might feel different. It might have a different quality to it.
And once we get to where we can regulate, and as a couple, a benefit is our partner is going to see some of those physiological cues before I'm going to notice them. So if I'm noticing my husband's jaw getting tight or his cheeks getting red, telltale sign for my husband, I could go over and give him a hug and say, hey, is everything okay? That right there stops him from getting up higher than a 5. Or at least ideally it would, right? But it has to be safe to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not going up to him and being like, wow, you look pissed. It is in delivery. It is in keeping each other accountable in a loving way.
And then an important part that when I'm hearing you talking about, like your husband, let's give an example, right? You see his red cheeks, you see his clenched jaw. Now, what we have kind of control over is the meaning we make of why, especially if it's in response to something I did or said, or in the context of us like working on a project together. It's easy to get defensive, like they're mad at me or something I did.
Sure.
Or we can depersonalize it and say, this might not have nothing to do with me. And we're able to turn towards our partner a little more, versus if we're already saying they're mad at me, we're already in a defensive state and we're trying to protect ourselves.
Try not to assume causality here, right? If I see my husband's jaw get tight, even if we're talking about something, it'd be easy to jump to, oh, it must be this conversation. It could be something he thought about from work. It could be that his stomach hurts. I don't know. Right. So instead of saying like, oh, is this making you mad? Or making that assumption, you hear couples do it all the time. Instead saying, hey, I'm noticing.
Yeah.
Am I getting this right? Or can you tell me about it? Or is there something I can do to support you? All of those will help to soften my partner and create room for him to talk about it before he's pissed.
Yeah. I'm definitely learning not to label my wife's emotions.
Don't label people's emotions.
Even though like intuitively, and that's the meaning I'm making. Oh, they're intuitively upset because it was indirect, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for a great example of this is I was talking to my wife and I automatically kind of was insecure about maybe being a burden for her. She was trying to relax. And so I thought I upset her. Well, after getting through all the conflict, then we broke it down and she was already overwhelmed. I couldn't take any more in. It had nothing to do with me. It was a product of a lot of stuff going on, which is much different than where my initial thought led me to that. And when we think about emotion regulation, one out of cognitive behavioral therapy is changing your thoughts, like your initial thoughts and challenging them. My initial thought is this has to do with me. And now I feel like a burden or I feel upset or angry. And then it's like, well, hold on a sec. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but and then hold on a sec. Well, maybe there's something else going on with her or there's them or whatever.
Part of that regulation, I love what you just said, is also if I am too overwhelmed by other things, or if I'm already prickly, name that with your partner. Don't wait for them to step on it or to guess.
Landmines.
Right? Like this week, my husband tried to tell me something and I said, "Hun, I want to hear you, but in this moment I can't." That is a simple sentence that will avoid him feeling unheard after he tells me, me feeling irritated that he's coming at me with more stimulus, right? It takes all of that sting away. And, "Hey, hun, can you tell me in a half an hour?" Or text it to me so you don't forget. But like, let's touch base in a minute, right? If we can set our partner up for success on this, that helps.
And
that's ideal, of course. It's ideal.
And ideally, it's like, you think about it, if you care about this person, you're not going to want them to walk into this minefield. You got to let them know where the minefield's
Depends on how pissed I am that day.
You're like, come at
me. And if
me.
they did the dishes or not.
Come at me right now. I dare you. Step on this.
But that regulation isn't just about getting my emotions to come down or my nervous system to down regulate. Sometimes it's about naming what is.
Yeah.
Naming what my threshold is, where I'm coming at. There are days we wake up grouchy. Maybe that's just me. And I'll just turn to my partner and say, like, "I'm a little bitchy today." Right?
Yeah.
Then he knows, okay, she's a little bitchy. Fine. But it's not on him. Not that it would be anyway, because he's not responsible for it. But he's not sitting there guessing and ruminating in his own space.
Right. And that's a tough thing. And with couples, I see this a lot with like, what's triggering? I'll see patterns in what's triggering. So I'll like, okay, maybe this person has some low self-esteem around these areas. And it's almost like they're just waiting and looking at the relationship dynamics through that lens. And I feel like part of that self-regulation on an individual level is understanding what the triggers are in your relationship.
Absolutely.
Like, what is it that my partner does that sets me off? And again, not their fault.
Myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Or a trigger in response to something happening or within yourself.
Sure.
But understanding your own triggers and working through that. And a lot of times I feel like the insecurities there, past traumas.
But it can be, and this is where introspection is key. So if this doesn't come naturally to your family, get some support like a therapist. But like with the triggers, it's introspection too around, how do I say this? A certain word that irritates you or
tone.
Like I have past trauma about a particular loved one of mine who used to grab the back of my arm as a form of punishment. And my husband knows, do not touch the back of my arm. Right? We all have triggers that to other people would be totally innocuous and wouldn't even matter.
Yeah.
Or a certain word or phrasing or facial stuff, right? If we can know what those are, it makes us so much more equipped to handle them if they come up.
Yeah. And part of relationship success and the dynamics, those aren't independent of what's going on for you individually. And if you don't have together yourself individually, and we're not expected all the time, but in general, working towards understanding yourself, understanding how you can soothe yourself, then that can potentially improve the dynamics in the sense of, because even if, say, you're stressed with work and you're not managing the stress well, and even if you don't tell your partner about it, they experience that, and that's going to affect their experience of your stress too.
And your kids, it's a whole system thing.
It is, yeah. And we also want to rely on the couple system to navigate this. And so how do we soothe ourselves to get in a place to be more effective? And part of that is, one, like you said, name it, I'm on a landmine. Two is asking your partner, what do you need right now? Even if the partner's criticizing you, like, hey, I sense there's, what's going on? Is there anything that I can help with? Or, which is very hard to do, by the way.
Especially if I'm feeling worked up too, right?
Yeah.
Getting curious is no small task. It's hard. I tell couples too, if you're noticing that you can't get curious, you're probably triggered yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good time to call a pause. So couples timeouts, I think we've talked about it in a previous episode. But if both of us are having a hard time regulating individually, it's a good time for possibly a couples timeout. So there's important rules here. With the timeout, we're not weaponizing it. We're not, every time my partner tries to talk, calling a timeout.
Mm-hmm.
We do it gently, right? I need a timeout so I can go take a breath, regulate. Ideally, you're giving it at least 20 minutes to allow your prefrontal cortex to come back online. And we're using that time to soothe the body, not sharpen our sword.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to listen to music. I'm going to journal. I'm not going to sit there and say, like, when I get back in there, I'm coming for him. And we set a time to come back, time and location. Mm-hmm. You have to come back.
And the language you use to call a timeout, the language you use to come back. And here's one thing that there's a difference in between whether, and I love that we're revisiting this because I think it's so important, regardless, having talked about it in previous episodes, is we have to understand the difference between internal, external processors' needs in the context of taking space.
Say more about each of those.
So an external processor, which I am, we need to talk about it. Let's solve it right now. No, we're not taking space. You're going to solve this there's anxiety of it going unresolved. I say solved. We don't want to find solutions after.
Can mirror a pursuer, which we've talked about before.
Yep, the pursuer. So I'm pursuing to try to figure this out now. The internal processor is kind of like a bunch of waves coming at them, and they're on this little boat, and they're trying to make sense of the waves before they can even have a conversation about it. Mm-hmm. They need space to regulate, to make sense of it. Then they can go back and say something meaningful. They're often the ones that need the space, is the internal processor. Yeah. Us external processor, we're like, we don't need the space, but we don't think we need a space. So technically we do, because how we're approaching it is ineffective, right? We also
we're in an anxious cycle. Mm-hmm.
So the thing is that it's very easy for someone who's an internal processor to call space and not come back because that space is comfortable. And then that leads to a continual pursuer distancer. And the other thing too is the language you take. Yeah. And I love when couples, and I have them provide reassurance when they take space. Hey, I think we're getting a little heated right now. I don't know if this is going to be effective, and get this. And I want to hear you, and I want to get through this, and I'll come back. Just give me some space. And
we'll come back at 12:30 to the living room.
Yeah. And let's be real. Like, you might say 20 minutes, but we have lives. Works come in, kids come in. It may not be exactly 20 minutes. Give some grace, but make sure you come back or check in and say, how are you feeling?
That's it. So I tell partners, especially if you have someone who's anxious and wants to solve it now, if I'm calling space, I want to honor that this is hard for them, right? There's trust that comes into this activity. So if at the 20-minute mark, oh shit, things go haywire, talking to your partner, hey, Chris, I know we said, could we come back? Can we wait until we solve whatever it is? Mm-hmm. Making sure that he knows it's still front of mind. I'm not avoiding. I'm not sweeping under the rug.
Yeah.
It's still there. That's part of the trust of this. Also, if it's, hey, let's come back at 30 minutes. 30 minutes we come back and we're both still pissed, or one of us is still pissed, saying, I'm still feeling really worked up. I need another 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. You can do that. The key is you are communicating, and you must come back. And
you can't keep saying, I need another 30 and another 30 and another 30.
And when you do come back, there has to be room for both of you to talk. You can't call it to avoid your partner's feedback. That's the weaponizing.
Yeah. And the space is really important. Exactly what you're saying is to self-soothe. Mm-hmm. Granted, it's very hard depending on how you take it. You're not trying to say like, you're a piece of shit. Okay, time out. Right. And it's very hard in that moment for the one who wants to take the space. It's really hard, but providing that reassurance and kind of the language that you both agreed upon in the best way you can, give grace, we're humans, is going to help. Exactly what you said, Kim. It's like, provide the sense of safety that taking timeouts is safe, and my partner will come back, so I can trust this space, especially for external processors who may have a partner who just continues to distance, and you're like,
because that's not great.
I don't know if they're going to come back, and I don't trust it. So.
It's trust on both sides. Trust that for me as the one calling the timeout, often the distancer or the internal processor, trust that you're going to honor my space. And it's trust for the external processor that you're going to come back, and respect that I need that closure.
Yeah. And this is a way to kind of like stop the couple regulation, which is not effective, right? So oftentimes when we're dealing with stress, we turn to the loved ones. This is what we call dyadic coping. And when that's not effective, we might have to stop that and then go self-soothe, hence the timeouts. This is why timeout's a great like tool to at least start that process and remind ourselves, let's go engage in our tools. Now, the important thing is you are engaging in those tools.
You're not sitting in there planning what you're going to say next, right?
Yeah.
If you don't feel like you need a full timeout, maybe you just need a breather. One, and I think we've talked about this too, is we use green, yellow, red in our house. Yellow, I need a pause. This isn't just in conflict. This is if my partner is getting worked up about our kids, his mother, whatever, doesn't matter. Same for me. And I can look at him and say, hun, yellow. There's no judgment. Nothing is being communicated other than you're working up. Let's take a breather.
Hold on. So you're not sitting there doing something else. Your husband comes to talk to you, and you, as soon as he says like a half a word, you put your hand up, not looking at him. Red.
I've never done that yet.
Red.
Right. But it gives him a chance to, again, because I'm going to see some of these cues before he will.
Yeah.
Or with our kids. There are times that both of us get snappy with our kids because that's parenting. And he can come up and say, Kim, yellow. And then I go and take my breath. I walk away from the kids for a minute, and he'll give me more feedback because we have a safe relationship to do so of, hey, I think you hurt Harper's feelings, or I noticed you were really anxious. How can I support you tonight? Whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I want to talk about too is the imbalance of this process of regulation, because sometimes I get couples where one is really good at regulating and they're always in the role of trying to serve as kind of the regulating piece when they're trying to do it as a couple, right? So the couple or the partner who's like really dysregulated will continually go to the partner and say, I need your help. Like, I need to, vent or word vomit or process this stuff. And it's always that dynamic. I don't say always, but majority of the time it's always that dynamic. It's that dynamic the majority of the time. That puts a lot of strain on that partner. And it tells me, from the therapist side of, there needs to be a lot more individual regulation on this partner.
Sure.
Now, granted, it's easy when we're in the relationship to say, oh, my partner's way more dysregulated than me.
But we see that map out as couples.
We do. And when there's not a reciprocity in the sharing of dyadic coping and allowing that space for both to process stress, like Gottman has a great technique called the 30-minute stress reduction conversation. A lot of my couples do it at night, but it's really just to talk about any stress outside the relationship in the process. Talk, validate, don't try to solve, don't join the enemies. Like I love when couples are like, oh, this person at work. And then the partner's like, well, how did you say it? How did you talk to them? Because I know when you talk to me, it pisses me off. So did you do that? We're not doing any of that.
No. Where we see this dynamic of dysregulation get really rough is codependency. Because now my emotion isn't just like somewhat impacted by you. It is dependent on you. If that feels like your partnership, get some support, right? All of these dynamics we're talking about are things that can be supported, can be fixed, more or less. Not to perfection. That's not the goal of anyone. But our emotions, we should feel like we have control of them. And if we don't, that's a good cue that our regulation skills might need a little updating.
Yeah. Or at least have hope that we can be able to ground ourselves.
Sure.
Or what have you. But I love what you just said too about really kind of the idea of identity outside the relationship too. And the self-care piece is kind of what I was leading to from what you were saying. And it's not always is it like emotion regulation in the moment. And
absolutely.
And kind of just reacting. And that is one part of regulation, but the other part of preparing yourself is self-care.
Daily. So we don't
get to what you're talking about, where now my response is contingent upon my partner, right?
If I already start every day at a 3, that doesn't give my partner a lot of room to make a mistake.
Yeah.
Right? That self-care helps me start at a 1. So there's greater grace to be given, more movement. But my partner can't do that for me.
Yeah.
I hear this with parents, especially moms, of, I don't have time for that. So then they're chronically irritated. You have to make time, right? If you don't make time for your health, you are going to be forced to make time for the disease, period.
Then nothing's going to change.
That's physical disease, mental health disease, relational disease. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If you don't make time for the health, you will make time for the disease because you won't have a choice.
Yeah. And that's where, when I'm working with couples, I'm thinking about the dyadic coping. And when I think about dyadic coping or how couples manage stress together, because again, when we're managing stress, we always turn to our loved one, is what are their capacity levels? And as you mentioned earlier, when we talked about this, was the other partner has to have the capacity to receive it. And what
Yeah.
if they're stressed? And part of improving our capacity is the self-care piece.
Mhm.
So the self-regulation piece in the moment to soothe yourself and try to be present and not respond. And then the self-care piece is to improve your capacity to be present, to be curious,
Mhm.
and hopefully maybe not have to actually engage in some of the immediate self-regulation and grounding skills like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? We've talked about before, the 5 things you see, 4 things that you can physically feel with your skin, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, and then like 1 deep breath.
Mhm. Other tools that could be helpful. I was thinking about what are some other tangible things people could try. If you're getting worked up, mindfulness, right? And that goes with that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The
Mhm.
deep diaphragmatic 360 breathing. So belly, but it's not just about your belly expanding, it's your back, your ribs, the whole 360.
Mhm.
Going on a walk, getting in nature, grounding yourself,
Mhm.
right? Doing the things that fill you up. For some people, that's arts and crafts. That to me sounds like medieval torture. So it's getting to know what are the things for my body that work,
Mhm.
that are not things like drinking, weed, things of the sort,
Yeah.
right? But really figuring out what are the things I need to feel calm, fulfilled, supported. Is there a supportive friend? We're not calling the friend that's like, God, he's such an asshole. That's not going to help you, right? We need the friend that says, okay.
Or their family member or their mother.
Oh, Lord Jesus. Don't bring the mother in ever. Terrible idea.
Don't bring any shared mutual friend in this. Yeah.
But those things. So if it's a bath, a walk, a run, music, time with a certain person, taking a nap.
Yeah.
What are some other ones you think of?
Well, one that comes to my mind is from our guest, Michelle Becker, we had on, and Compassion for Couples. And this might not be something you do in the immediacy, but I know that for me personally, my wife and I went through her program, and my wife uses this a lot for me. But it's this idea of trying to understand and kind of bring to mind this like vulnerable, often younger self of me or version of our partner.
Mhm.
And it's like, oh, they're a product of this, they're a product of that. And you depersonalize it. Like what they're doing and how they're responding is a product of their environment rather than they're intentionally doing this as like an evil person. And it helps actually soften it and not want to view them in this negative sentiment. You kind of see this positive sentiment. And Michelle Becker does a way better job of describing that in her book and through her courses. But I love that because it's another way to change how we perceive our partner's intentions,
Absolutely.
which then affects how we then respond. So it's kind of like on an individual level, regulating and using kind of more of a dyadic understanding, right?
The compassion, the curiosity.
Yeah, very hard. And essentially the sum of what we're saying is when we're managing stress, we really want to go to our partners, and having a healthy dynamics with couples is important, but that's not independent of how we're also on an individual level managing our own stuff. And it's not okay to continue to blame our partner for them to change.
Correct.
And it might be the case that they might be the one who's dysregulated more. Then we have to check in. What's going on? What's happening? And maybe, go to therapy, maybe have a therapist say we need individual therapy.
Sure.
And refer out. And that's possible. A lot of us are going through hard stuff, and it might change, and we might not be able to regulate right now in this moment, depending on what we have going on in our lives.
And you said this, but I really want to highlight this point. My ability to regulate is not dependent on my partner. It is not about them avoiding every single trigger I have ever had. It's not about them always being perfect or doing everything perfectly. It's when they do step on a landmine, when I'm having a rough day, they're having a rough day, whatever it is, can I soothe my own body? It's not on them to soothe your body, people. It's on you to soothe your own body and system.
And continually engage in maintenance, right? We talked about this before. It's kind of like a car. Like you got to have maintenance. And what I like from like the Gottman stuff is the positive sentiment, doing things that help improve positive sentiment. So when your partner is not perfect and doesn't come back in 20 minutes, you know what? They probably didn't intend to do this. They probably are stressed, like they're engaging in this stuff.
Or they fell asleep.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt instead of this negative sentiment. So there's a lot of things on the immediate level, such as like the breathing, the soothing, the timeouts. And then there's stuff long-term, like the compassion for couples, potentially. Play, intimacy, connecting, finding ways of connecting, continue like couples that do that 30-minute stress reduction conversation, the Gottman intervention. They will do that continuously, even if they're not super stressed, but it's a way to connect.
It's a tough one. Even as therapists, we struggle with it. So know that it really is tough. This is a lifelong journey. And with regulation, What works today may not work tomorrow. So you may have to update your software kind of repeatedly.
I love that, because sleep is a very important part of updating our software.
If you've got external factors, health concerns,
Mhm.
disrupted sleep, change of the seasons, all the things, parenting, you may have to update your software to accommodate for those things.
Yeah.
Well, this has been Relationships Inside Out, where today we talked about regulation, both of self and dyadic. As always, if anyone has any questions, concerns, or topic suggestions, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Thanks.
Thanks.